Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be breaking down the decisions behind this Queen Marchesa deck that I created for Spencer, a friend of mine, also known as SpentahB, right here. And I'm just going to be doing a not so formal breakdown for my my decisions behind the cards in this deck, decisions behind my process of making this deck. It wasn't anything like too insane. Wasn't like, calculating nuclear equations or anything. But there were a couple uh, specific choices that I made, and I thought it could be a fun time to do kind of a walk down memory lane. Because really, this deck was meant to be a hall of fame, a buffet, if you will, of Spencer's top picks for cards. And I'm not going to cover every card, starting off this video. Yes, let's cover the most important stuff. Swamp. No, none of that. None of that. But I'm just here to point out a few notable inclusions. Of course, we have things like Esper Sentinel. That's if you're making a white deck, it's probably in there. Not you as in, Spencer. Just you as in the second person. It's just a very good card. Uh, Something that I wanted to point out is it turns out that a lot of cards that made the cut in this deck just happen to actually be commanders from your Spencer's previous decks, like Valky God of Lies down here. Flipping over to Tybalt. This deck ravaged our play group for it, from my memory, at least like 10 to 20 games. This deck was like the boogeyman of the table. I have never experienced so much interaction in Rakdos, and it made the game really fun and interesting. But I think it got retired because it was a very dominant deck. But I thought in this deck it actually has an interesting like purpose. It's one of the few cards that it's not really tied to like the theme. It's not super like political, but it is a value piece that if like left unchecked and it just sticks around, it'll, as I learned from history, it becomes really powerful over time. You know, I mean, that last ability giving you basically like a souped up underworld breach, as crazy as it is to say. But moving on from that one, of course we have the white like ramp. Not a ton available. Uh, More notable stuff. Other commanders that Spencer had played are in this deck. There's a good amount of them. We have Shieldred, which is of course just a good card, but he also had a Shieldred deck. We have Shadrix, perhaps my favorite deck to play against, because although I would frequently get just run over by this deck, it never felt like you were losing the game until you looked at his board and he had a like Deathbringer Liege out, and it hits you that like, oh, at any point he can just destroy everything I care about. Got you. So aside from Shadrix, which I knew it was one of the first cards I put in the deck, especially because I knew that I was going to put Professional Facebreaker, Grim Hireling. These are both cards that have become like famous for how powerful they are in that like combat heavy pod that we have. And I didn't see the light at first when it came to Grim Hireling. It was Spencer actually who started playing Grim Hireling at our table, and through seeing the work it did, I started adding it to decks. Same actually goes with Keen Duelist. This was a card that completely flew under my radar, and then it showed up in his Shadrix deck, and just the amount of like goodwill that you were earning with the table, he was earning with the table. It was something that like I picked up on that, like, well, people aren't really swinging on him because I kind of hoping for that card. It also was really nice, like when I was in like last place, maybe he'd give me a card. It was a great time. Really, that's kind of the theme of this deck. Like, yes, it's the Hall of Fame for Spencer cards. I tried to pick your favorite cards throughout multiple decks to combine into one. But it was also, as it turns out, when I was doing that, a lot of the cards that you would tend to gravitate towards are cards that are inherently fun to play with. Like there are, of course, are some staples, and there's like protective stuff like Giver of Runes. There's some control elements like Kumbal, but for the most part, you pick a lot of cards. He picks a lot of cards that are. I'm just gonna start saying you, isn't I'm just talking straight to Spencer, to you. So you'd pick a lot of cards that are really great to have on the table as your opponent. Like it encourages a healthy play pattern for the table. It makes conversation easier for politicking. One example, perfect segue, is Brina the Demigorg. This card in your Shadrix deck was perhaps like the hidden commander of the deck. Regularly, this card would hit like 10 power, or you'd buff up Shadrix, or you'd have like Orzhov Advocist, and now you're giving your creatures like 6 counters a turn cycle. I just never realized how powerful this card was until it showed up in that deck. And although you haven't played like Dolthy Voidwalker a ton, I thought it just made a ton of sense in the deck with your commander creating, making you the monarch. I assume at some point, assuming everyone else is doing something, you may lose the monarch. That's okay. I wanted you to have some attackers, some creatures that were just hard to prevent from getting that monarch back. Who has a shadow creature other than Dolthy Voidwalker ready to block this dude? Not a thing. Nada. No one. Another card that I remember you playing in that Shadrix deck, that may be a recurring theme, by the way, is the Archon of Coronation. It goes perfectly in this deck. We want to have those monarch effects. Also, just a surprisingly strong effect if you have a way to continuously get the monarch again. You just effectively like tax evasion setup. Just avoiding having to pay your dues. People can't really get in for substantial damage. One thing that I'm a little bit on the fence about with this deck is the inclusion of Serra Ascendant. So, Serra Ascendant is, of course, as we all know, a true gamer magic card. But this deck isn't really a life gain deck. It has some cards that gain you life, but it also has cards that lose you life. And a concern of mine coming into this is if I put too many life loss effects in here, like, of course, like Ancient Tomb. We got like Lotho. And then even just like the monarchy encouraging that people hit you is kind of concerning, because if people do that enough, that the game gets pretty hard. These talismans also deal damage to you. But regardless, Serra Ascendant is just such a good. When you are ahead, even just a turn 1 Serra Ascendant can oftentimes guarantee that you remain above that 30 health threshold. Just because gaining 6 life a turn, especially after turn 2. Not many people are going to be playing creatures that can attack on turn 1, besides your odd Ragavan. But even more so, who would want to block it even if they could? There are no creatures out that early in the game that are prepared to block Serra Ascendant and live to tell the tale. But there are a few elements of life gain. We already talked about Shieldred. That's part of the reason I put Suture Priest. I remember you playing your Suture Priest in another deck that you have brought to the table a good amount in the past. That deck being Mangara. And when I knew the theme of this deck was going to be playing the all-time hits of Commander with Spencer, Mangara was at like the top of the list. for this deck. It's super good politically. It discourages people from attacking you. It rewards you for just kind of chilling, which is kind of what the deck wants to do, just sitting back and letting people do their thing, and then poking people for damage on your turn. It's surprising how much chip damage this deck has just from like existing. With stuff like Kumbal, with Shieldred, Keen Duelist, things like Karn being donated away, and then now he's attacking your opponents. Just this kind of free incremental damage. And Mangara slots really well into that type of a play style. That you have all these things going on and he's just chilling. But to go back to that life gain idea, Sutra Priest, I felt like you have enough abilities that are generating some tokens, you have enough creatures in combination with that you'll get some value out of this. But it's also like a hate piece. If people are playing creatures against you to try to block your stuff, being able to punish token generation. Tokens are like the bane of this deck's existence because you don't have a ton of ways to guarantee damage, but at least having something tailored to that, or at least a couple cards, will hopefully make it feel like you're never in a situation where you have nothing to do, that you're just going to lose the Monarch and then you're screwed kind of deal. I think a good segue from this is into some of the more political cards. Actually, while I'm looking at them, how about we cover the inclusion of Giver of Runes, Mother of Runes. These were also in your Mangara deck. They will help you connect through on the damage. They'll also be protection for some of these value pieces. Kumbal, Shieldred. Gotta have Dockside because I'm a degenerate and I want to see my friends destroy my other friends. But moving to like the more political side of things, Donald Trump. No, I'm joking. I put stuff like, of course, Brina, but also like Humble Defector. Not because you've played Humble Defector a ton. I just think it makes sense in this deck. I think that light sub-theme of like passing cards around. Humble Defector, Karn. We have Yes Man in here. We have Zansha in here. It's a nice sub-theme of like encouraging people to attack each other in the case of like Zansha and Karn, but also like stuff like Humble Defector and Yes Man and Keen Duelist. Like these cards like make people inherently not want to swing on you. They want to earn your favor. They want to be in good graces with you because the last thing you want is someone just hands you a Zansha and now every turn cycle you're losing like 6 life. Your opponents are drawing cards and you just have this random ass. This is a minion, by the way, a Phyrexian minion of all things. Yeah, right there. You just have this dude just swinging. I think it was fun. I think it's a fun concept. But I will say that if you're finding that games are difficult to end, that like you can get a decent foothold, but once you get to that mid game, it's difficult to close out. As I touched on in the written guide, I really think some neat includes in this deck would be Slicer, the hired muscle, and Alexios. And having that combination of Zansha, Slicer, Alexios, Karn, like having a bunch of these creatures out that are just swinging in on your opponents effectively every turn becomes such a like chaotic game. Like even if people didn't want to get involved in combat before, tough luck, and they really can accelerate the game if you're finding that that's an issue. But if that's not an issue, and if this deck functions exactly how it was intended to function in that mid-game pocket where it establishes a decent early presence with some value, with a little bit of hate, and then it just kind of rides the wave until you get your commander out, start drawing extra cards, gaining some favor, and then looking to end the game with really a couple things. There's not a ton of hard-hitting endgame. This isn't like a drop your Craterhoof Behemoth type deck. But this is a deck that has like Descent into Avernus, that has Luminarch Ascension, both famously Spencer cards. I think you and I both play Descent into Avernus a ton. This card ends games so quickly. A turn like 2 Descent into Avernus, the game will be over before turn 7. Uh, that's like an overshot, probably before turn like 6. Something else I wanted to mention is there's notably like a lack of the courts. I didn't put all of the courts in this deck because my mindset was I know how good these 3 courts are because I've seen you play them in some capacity. Definitely these 2. And I think I've played Court of Ire. I think you have played Court of Ire in different decks. Um, and so I know for a fact these 3 are good at what they're trying to do. Some of the more recent ones, although they're interesting, there's like Court of Embereth. I think I have it in considering. Don't mind the 40 considering cards. Court of Embereth is interesting, but in this deck, it's not like you're going to have a billion creatures just sitting around. And if you do, it's not like you'd be attacking. And having a 3-1 Red Knight with no evasion is just destined to die the first time someone swings in. If you don't have, death touch tokens, it just seems like, although it's nice to have additional ways to get Monarch, it isn't better than the options we've seen work. And to that point, like Curse of Lochthwain sounds like a good card on paper, right? Because it gives you the Monarch, it incentivizes that kind of chill strategy, and on your upkeep, you get to steal people's cards. But this card is like deceptively slow. Like, assuming that you keep the Monarch on your upkeep, so 1 full turn cycle, you exile 1 card off the top of an opponent's library, and you can cast it for free. Now, I'm no expert in statistics, but I've played an Atali deck, and let me tell you, that deck is good because it exiles until it hits a non-land. The amount of times that this card is just going to hit a land and do nothing, or it's going to hit a mana rock, and it's like, sweet, I just protected the monarchy so I could play this Felwar Stone. Or it's going to hit something that just is a synergy piece for another deck and has no value to what you're trying to do. It's high. It's a super high percentage that's going to be the case, unfortunately. But rather than talking about the cards we didn't put in, let's talk about the cards we did put in. We have Black Market Connections. One thing that struck me when I was making this deck, I can vividly recall that, much like myself, my dear friend Spencer here is a value player. And there are few cards more value-based than Black Market Connections. Well, okay, it'll give you value, but at a cost. This is also one of those cards that I was concerned about because it has kind of some anti-synergy with not Suture Priest, Serra Ascendant. Same goes for the One Ring. Same goes for Descent into Avernus. These cards, although they're good in the deck, they are not specifically great. Oop, let me just drop stuff. They're not specifically great in combination with Serra Ascendant. I think viewing it from the perspective of Serra Ascendant is really good early game, and when you transition into mid game and you start needing extra value to push your game plan over the top, I think that's when we really start to consider letting yourself drop below that HP, or it's even very possible that like Serra Ascendant might just get you to high enough HP that it can sustain continued Black Market Connections activations. Maybe you've had it out since turn 2 and you've gained 12 life off of it. That's effectively that's like 2 full sends on Black Market Connections, and then you'd still be full HP. That's a pretty good spot to be in. One thing worth mentioning, the One Ring makes you lose life, Black Market Connections makes you lose life, but Descent to Avernus deals damage. So something like solitary confinement with descent into Avernus out is a lethal combination. This will end the game unless someone just farewell wipes your board, kind of deal. Uh, going along with that, Glacial Chasm, another Spencer All-Star, goes insane with that combination. Plus, to kind of jump around a little bit, I talked earlier about how there's a good amount of like passing things around in this deck. One example of that is Coveted Jewel, of course. I also put in Homeward Path, Green Dragon Inn, everyone's favorite card that you've totally heard about. And that, I feel like that is like when you top deck a Homeward Path in this deck, or you gamble for it, or you Demonic Tutor, or Scheming Symmetry, any of these things. If you have a board state where, like, someone has your Coveted Jewel, someone has your Karn, someone has your Yes Man, your Humble Defector, Homeward Pathing in that game state is like a factory reset of the board, where now you're guaranteed to draw like 4-6 cards. You got 3 extra mana. It's just a huge swing. It can be a really big swing. Other notable includes, I knew Strixhaven Stadium was going in this deck the second I decided on the commander. I have lost to this card more times than I can count. Not because multiple people in my playgroup have killed me with it. Spencer has killed our table with this card. Like, he hasn't killed the whole table with this card, but, like, he'll kill, like, regularly 1 to 2 people with this card. It is, at this point, statistically, I'm pretty confident it's more likely that he will kill someone when it hits the field than he won't. At some point. But jumping around a little bit, just because there's a lot to touch on, I tried to, at first I had Vampiric Tutor in here, but the more I thought about it, he doesn't really run Vampiric Tutor. You don't really run Vampiric Tutor. So I put, like, Scheming Symmetry in here. I thought it fit the theme of being a very political deck. Praetor's Grasp. Every time that I've seen Praetor's Grasp resolve, it is usually, okay, maybe not every time. It is usually one of the funniest cards to see resolve, is what I'll say. Because, let's say we're versing our friend Sean's deck that is like a Muldrotha deck. He'll go in and find, like, Spencer will Praetor's Grasp him and go in and find, like, the Thassa's Oracle in his deck. And, like, he'll, like, look at the deck and be like, oh, it's like a Demonic Consultation deck. Okay, Thassa's Oracle, and then just, like, leave it in exile. Like, single-handedly saving the table. Other cards, worth mentioning. Of course, we have, like, Gamble. We have Toxic Deluge, Jessica's Will. A lot of these value strong cards. I associate 2 cards with you, Spencer, more than any other cards in this deck. And that's Sudden Spoiling and probably Ink Shield. Now, this is notable because, as Spencer would attest, it's not like he has these cards in every deck, and they are fairly situational, but these are memorable cards. When they resolve, when they do what they are intended to do, it is like a game-winning, or in the case of Ink Shield, it's a game-winning effect. Or it's a game-losing effect in the case of Sudden Spoiling. Being a combat deck, or a deck that cares about your commander's abilities. Like, this is just back-breaking. I love playing it. He's made me a believer. I now follow the Church of Sudden Spoiling. But another card that I knew to put in here was Angel's Grace. When this card would be played, whether it was in, like, casual or CDH for the memes, Spencer and I would both kind of pop off at the moment of, like, okay, like, Angel's Grace? I think it really also adds to like the longevity of this deck, that it is just accruing value, and then it has so many ways to just stop people from executing their game plan. You know, I mean, having a way to just stop yourself from losing is great. Darkness, wonderful. You don't want to take combat damage. Makes sense. Um, Stuff like Helio's Intervention, you know, synergizing with Sarah Ascendant to give you that HP, to give you removal. But like, when it comes to the longevity, uh, these two cards are huge factors in that. But there's also like Reprieve, which is I've been, you know, learning is a surprisingly solid, like non-blue sorta counter. A lot of the times when this has been used at the table, from Spencer, not naming names, uh, it it's used at a very smart time. Like, you know, you're not reprieving someone's soul ring. That just doesn't make sense. But if I cast like a shamanic revelation and I would draw like 14 cards, returning it to my hand when I only have a mana pool of like 6 lands, no mana dorks or something, you know, uh, so I can't immediately cast it again, is like, it's such a strong solution to the problem, because even if I do cast it the next turn, like the tempo loss is like immediately felt. So, you know, I didn't need to give you a whole segment why I included Reprieve, or Tybalt's Trickery for that matter, because it's kind of like in the same ballpark of like odd situational counter spells that are turns out are really good. Um, Transitioning away from that, one of the probably the last includes was Mirage Mirror. I was thinking about how this deck, you know, because it really does want to kind of just sit around, uh, it would be a deck that would benefit from Mirage Mirror, because you could kind of just like, you know, untap, pass, and if you have a Smothering Tithe out, or if you no, you know, it's just so versatile. Like if you notice that there's a good piece on the battlefield, like a Rhystic Study or something. I've seen it copy a Rhystic Study before, specifically from Spencer, and it's really just such a versatile card. It's been a while since I've seen you play it, also, and I've become a believer. I was hoping, and this is a prime example of one of the cards when I say that I wanted this to be like a Hall of Fame, like a buffet of famous Spencer cards. This is a prime example of that. This is a card that like gives me nostalgia when I look back and I think of all the times that this card has come out, how interesting it has been in the state of the game. Pretty much every time I've seen it, it's had an impact in some capacity on the game. It appears that we're beginning to kind of come to an end. A lot of the other cards, you know, they're staples. Deadly Relic, Deflecting Swat. You know, we have our tutors. Not a lot of choices went into that. Solitary Confinement, of course, I touched on earlier a little bit. Just iconic with that Mangara deck. This, combined with land tax, woke me up in a cold sweat many nights. It was brutal. This is like one of those like deck checks. You know, like you're getting checked. Do you have the proper removal in this deck to deal with some threats? Like to deal with some hard to remove threats. I'll tell you right now, a red deck, a black deck, a blue deck are probably not getting rid of Solitary Confinement. Maybe blue, and maybe black if it draws Feed the Swarm. But it has so much like longevity, and with land tax it just was never leaving the battlefield. At first I wanted to put land tax in this deck and I upped the basic count, but then when I tried playtesting it, you know, a 3 color commander with like more than 8 basics feels rough, because if you're trying to actually get that smorgasbord of cards, you know, with varying colors and effects and such, you will frequently just run into situations where you didn't draw land tax and you can't cast any of the cards in your hand. And that's the last thing I wanted for you to experience. So I took land tax out, but I kept Solitary Confinement in because my reasoning was Monarch kind of like mitigates the cost of this card, right? Like you're skipping your draw step, sure, but if you wanted to, you could effectively leave this up indefinitely, just off the idea that you have the Monarch, you can't take damage, you draw a card, you discard the card. But you also have other drawing effects, so it's not like, you're just going to be sitting there stuck in a rough spot. Luminarch Ascension, I feel like, is another way of, I touched on it earlier with like ending the game. I think Luminarch Ascension is a prime candidate. This deck really does want to just sit and chill, and having your commander out, having the Monarch out, commander has Death Touch, and people are not really going to want to swing into you, even if they want the Monarch. And let's say, worst case scenario, you got the Monarch out, you have this out, one person swings on you, they take the Monarch, you don't get a counter that turn. Okay, well the next turn, the person's probably not swinging on you. They're going to swing on the person that just took the Monarch. And so you're guaranteed like one counter there. The next person, they're probably also going to swing on this person who just got the Monarch again. Like, it actually has a lot of synergy with the deck, because sure, people might be incentivized to attack you once, but then after that, the rest of the turn cycle, they're disincentivized from attacking you. They're incentivized to attack your opponents, because presumably they also want the Monarch. Okay, I think that just about does it. We're winding up, coming to an end. I appreciate you ordering this deck for me and supporting me, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you.